Hello everyone and welcome to this month's Total Quilter Monthly for July 2019. My name is Mark Garetz and I am a National Floriani educator. And you know, Faux Chenille has become very popular again recently, so we're going to take a look at how to create a Faux Chenille block and other objects in Total Quilter or My Decorative Quilter. So to make sure we're all on the same page, let's talk for a bit about what chenille and faux chenille are. So chenille is a special fabric with fluffy ridges. Kind of looks like the picture there on the right, except that's actually a picture of faux chenille. We're going to create a chenille look or faux chenille by using layered side-by-side fabric strips and then fluffing up the edges. We're going to create the strips with solid pieces of fabric, stitching them down with parallel rows of stitches, then cutting between the rows to make the strips. So before we get into the software steps, let's just talk about what's going to happen when we stitch it out, so as we go through the software it'll make a little bit more sense. First, what we're going to do is we're going to stitch out a placement line on our base fabric. Then we're going to lay down 3 pieces of fabric we're going to use for the chenille effect, lining them up with the placement line, and then we're going to stitch out a tack down line to hold the fabric in place while we stitch the rows across. And you can see on the right there's a little picture of what the rows of stitching across are going to look like. And doing that tack down helps keep the presser foot from being caught under the fabric edges as we stitch those lines. Then we're going to stitch the rows to hold the chenille fabric to the base fabric. Then we'll remove the tack down stitch so we can open up the row ends so we can slice and cut between the rows, and then finally we're going to fluff up the edges with a brush. So let's get into the software steps of creating this chenille block. So of course you're going to want to open up your software and click the Create a New Design on the splash page that comes up, so we've got a new blank page to work with. You're going to want to turn on your grid, and you can do that by clicking this icon right here. I have mine on right now, but if you click this grid icon over on the left, it'll toggle between a grid view and a non-grid view, and you want the grid to show for this. And then let's set up our thread palette. So I've got the Floriani cotton palette selected here, and I've got that selected because it's got just a very few colors in the palette. Makes it easy to switch between colors and not have to scroll all around between the huge color palette. So the way you do that is you come to this icon at the bottom left here, select thread chart, click on it, and then come up here to Floriani cotton and click on that. And just a side note, as we go through today's video, if I say click, that means a normal left click. If I want you to right click, I will specifically say right click. Okay, so we are going to get started, and let's go ahead and set up our grid, because that's kind of important to this project. So come up to the top ruler, hover over it with your cursor, and then right click on it and select grid settings. Okay, now we want to set our horizontal grid spacing to 1/2 inch. So right now I've got it on 1/4. So I'm going to change that to 0.5, and that will give me a 1/2 inch. And I'm going to set the vertical the same way. So both horizontal and vertical go to 0.5. And then grid major, I'm going to select I'm going to make actually a 6-inch block for this demonstration. So I want my grid major to give me a nice boundary for the block so I can see where I'm going. So what this means is for every 8 of these, I'm going to get a grid major line. And what I really want is grid major at every 3 inches so that I have a grid going down the center, both horizontally and vertically, and one on the edge. So that means for 3 of these, I need to have this every 6, because 6 times 0.5 is 3. So I'm going to put 6 and 6. And I also, while I'm here, want to check, I don't want to check any of these. I want snap to grid, snap to guidelines, and snap to anchors all off. Okay, so then we're going to click OK, and that's going to give us a nice big grid. And this part is 3 inches square, this part is 3 inches square. So what that means is that this area right here is our nice 6-inch block. So that gives me a place to go from. And I said we wanted snap to grid turned off, but I'm going to temporarily turn it on by right clicking and clicking snap to grid. So I right clicked on the ruler bar and click snap to grid. That's because this first thing I'm going to do, which is create a square that's going to become the basis for our block, I want that to snap to the grid. So I'm going to choose my rectangle here from my built-in shapes, and if you don't see the rectangle, click the little drop down and select the rectangle, and that's going to, my cursor you can see has got a little rectangle by it. That tells me that I'm going to draw a rectangle if I click and drag. So I'm going to come up to this point right here in the upper left hand corner where my block's going to be and click and drag that all the way down to the bottom, and you can see because I have snap to grid turned on, it literally snaps into place without me having to be very precise. And so that gives me a 6-inch block. All right, so that's nice. And once I've done that, I'm going to right click to tell it I'm done. I don't really need to do that. I'm just going to click off it. Then I'm going to right click on my grid. Then I'm going to uncheck snap to grid because from now on I don't want to snap to the grid. Now what we want to do is we want to draw some parallel lines like this across our block. So that's why I have the 1/2 inch spacing here, because that's the grids that I want. I want it a 1/2 inch on my lines, 1/2 inch apart. But typically we don't have the grid or the lines going straight up and down or perpendicular to the block like that. So what we usually want is having them at an angle. Now there's nothing that says you can't make them go up and down, but we usually get a better look of the block if it's not just straight up and down, if it's at an angle. But that's something you can choose. If you want them to go straight up and down, then you can ignore the next thing we're going to do, because that is we're going to rotate our block outline to match the angle that we want our grid to go. Because we can't actually rotate this grid, it's going to stay in its position, but we can rotate the block so that our grid goes across it in the way we want. So you can use any angle you want. Some people will use 60, some people will use 45, or any angle. We're going to use 45 today. So I'm going to come over to my properties box here and click transform. And down here I've got to rotate, and in here I'm going to put 45 degrees to get a nice 45-degree angle, and click apply. And so now my block is rotated at a 45-degree angle relative to the grid lines. So now my grids are going across this block at a 45-degree angle. And then once we draw in our grid lines, we'll be able to actually just rotate our grid backwards 45 degrees, or not our grid, rather, the block back 45 degrees, and it'll be in a more traditional orientation for us to look at. All right, so the next step that we're going to do is we're going to turn this outline here into some stitches. And we're going to create a set of tack down stitches and a set of placement lines. And to do that, I'm going to just have the block selected like I already do. Going to come down to my one-click wonder here, and I'm going to click run. So that's going to give us a run stitch. So that's going to convert this into a run. And the first one, this is going to become our placement line. So that one I'm going to leave at the standard single run, and I'm going to leave it at the standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length, because it's just a placement line, and however we stitch it's going to be fine. And it's going to auto assign a color, and I've got it in wine. It really doesn't matter. That's what it assigned it to. The colors still really don't matter, because the color that matters is what you load onto the machine. Again, the thread down here, again, I'm using the Floriani cotton, but you don't have to actually stitch with that thread. You can use any thread you like. Right, so that gives us our placement line, and what we're going to do is we're going to hoop up a piece of fabric, and then we're going to stitch this out. Then we're going to use that placement to put our chenille fabric down. Once we have our chenille fabric down, we need to tack it down, and that not only holds it in place, but more importantly, it keeps the edges of the fabric from getting caught on the presser foot as it travels back and forth like that. And so we want to tack that down. So what we're going to do is come back to our original artwork, which is at the top here, and I'm going to convert it once again into a run stitch. So I'm going to click run one more time. That gives me a second run. Now I want this run to be a different color from the first one because that color change is going to make the machine stop. This is very similar to what we do with an applique. And to get it to stop, I'm going to change the thread color. So it really doesn't matter what we change it to. I can change it to any of these colors, but let's go ahead and change it to this green. And that will create a new object here because I've changed the thread color. So the machine's going to do this, and it's going to stop and then stitch this one. Now, since this is just a tack down line, and we actually need to remove these stitches before we slice the chenille fabric up, we want to make this a lot more like a basting stitch than a regular stitch. So what I'm going to do is come in here to my stitch length, and I'm going to change it to 6 millimeters, which is going to make a nice long stitch, make it easy to pull out, and I'm going to click apply. So that one is going to be a tack down stitch, and now all we need to do is create our stitches that go across for our chenille rows. So to do that, we're going to use our run stitch tool, and it's located right here, and we're actually going to draw those stitches in. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our run stitch tool. I'm going to use the same color because it can actually go ahead and stitch this tack down line. If you want it to stop, and let's go ahead and change the color so it does stop, because there might be a good reason for it to stop, because you might want to trim the fabric before you actually create the chenille effect. So let's go ahead and change the color one more time. We can change back to that wine color because all we're doing is making it stop. So now when I draw, I will draw in wine. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw across it by clicking at the point where this set of lines intersects this grid line right here, and I'm going to come down and end the line right there. And so I'm going to do that all the way across the block. Now, this line right here is very close to the edge. So I have a choice. I can move my block over so that I don't have this little point here, or I can just ignore it, or I can actually just make a little tiny line of stitches here. But I think we're going to move it over. So let's get everything. I'm going to click on all items in my sequence view, and I'm going to nudge this over using the keyboard. And I apologize you can't see me using the keyboard, but I'm going to hold down the control key on my keyboard, and I'm going to move this over to the right a bit so that the line, the vertical lines of the grid line up with the edges of my block. Now this won't always happen. Sometimes you have to make a compromise, but this gives me a little bit better piece of fabric over here to fluff up. All right, so you can do that or not do that. Again, it's your option, but we're going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to click off it now to deselect it, and I'm going to ignore these purple lines now. I'm just going to look at these dashed lines. And again, what I'm going to do is grab my run stitch tool. I'm in green, so once again I'm going to click wine, and I'm going to start at the top here. Just get somewhere close in here. It really doesn't matter if you're super precise with these lines. So I'm going to click right here, and a tip is if I hold down the shift key and I click on that edge, I will get a nice straight vertical line. If I just click it, I will get a not so straight line. Again, it doesn't matter so much for this, how straight the line is, but I like to see a nice straight line. So I'm going to hold down shift when I click that second point. When I've drawn that first line in, I'm going to right click to end it because I want that to be a separate object. You might think, well, why don't I just run stitch over here and then stitch back up and then run stitch over here and stitch back down? I want this to have tack down stitches at the beginning and the end because I want that to actually hold. All right, I want that to be a nice strong stitch because we're going to put a lot of pressure on that stitch when we rough up the fabric and when we cut it. So we want that to be a nice strong stitch. In fact, later on we're going to convert this into a bean stitch to give it some real good strength to hold that fabric into place. So once I've done that, I can continue to draw in my remaining pieces. So I'm going to get my next run stitch by clicking that icon. Click somewhere right in there. Again, I'm holding down the Shift key and clicking right in there. I'm having a little trouble with my mouse today. There I go. And I'm going to right click to end it. Okay, and you can see that I'm jumping. You can see that jump stitch all the way up to the top here. Now why don't I just start down here and go here? That would make less travel and it would actually stitch a lot faster. However, I want to try and force the machine to actually trim because I don't want it to stitch along here for the same reasons we just discussed. So I'm going to do the maximum distance to kind of force that machine to trim between this point and this point. So I'm just going to continue to repeat those steps. Again, I'm going to grab my run stitch tool and I'm going to start back right up here and I'm going to hold down Shift, come back down to about there. I didn't get right on the line as you can see. I'm going to right click to end it, but this really doesn't matter that much. Okay, we can be as precise as we want, but in the end of the day, if you're off a little tiny bit on these lines, it really doesn't matter because no one's going to see them. They're going to get all fluffed up with the chenille fabric. All right, so I'm going to keep repeating that with all these lines here. So I'm going to click right on that line, come right down to here, and Shift click, and right click. So you might be wondering why I wouldn't use snap to grid, and that's because at some points like here and here, snap to grid is pretty darn close to where we want, and a lot of places they are, but other places it's just not close at all. So I'm just going to continue to make my run stitches. So I'm going to click right here, and then I'm going to Shift click at the bottom, right click to end it, and this really doesn't take all that long. So I'm going to click here again and come down to this point and Shift click and right click, and one more. I'm going to click, and then I'm going to Shift click right in here, Shift click and right click, and then I've got one more right here that I'm going to do, and that is here and right. Shift click right here and right click to tell it I'm done. Okay, so I've now created about half the block. Now this block that we're doing is perfectly symmetrical. So I could actually select all these run stitches and I can just copy and paste and flip them over here. If I do that, what's going to happen is it's going to stitch like this, then it's going to come over here and stitch into the center. Now that's not all so bad for this. If we were doing a normal design or we were perfectionists, we'd actually do all of these. So it's up to you. I'm going to use the shortcut though. I'm going to right click on this and select copy, and then I could right click and select paste, or I can use these copy paste icons out here. I'll use that. Then I'm going to flip this horizontal, and then I'm going to move it over because it should line up pretty good. And I didn't line it up really good with the mouse, so I'm going to use my control arrow keys to line it up better. Move it in a bit. Alright, so now that's pretty well lined up with my grid, and I've got my design done. So if I wanted to, I could try and adjust the stitch order to get these to stitch, you know, from here down, but it really doesn't matter. I don't mind if the machine moves over here and then stitches in this way. So that's just kind of a shortcut. Now this block is symmetrical, so you could do that trick. But you don't have to use a block. You could use a shape. All right, so we'll take a look at that when we're done with this block, but we want to do one more thing. We want to select all of the stitches, and I'm doing that by selecting the top level here. And I'm going to go to my run type and change from a single run. Actually, I'm going to go here to run extra and change my bean style to bean. And then I want to have my bean repeats at 3, and I'm going to click apply. And so that's going to make bean stitches out of all of these. And what that's going to do is give me extra secure stitches to hold that fabric down. All right, so that's actually our block. All you need to do is save it. But before we save it, let's re-rotate it. So let's go to all items, and let's go up to our transform. And we did 45 degrees the first time. To rotate it backward, we have to subtract 45 degrees from 360, and that actually makes 315. So if I put in 315 and click apply, that will rotate it back. And so now what we've got is a square block, normal kind of square block with these chenille lines going across it. So now if we watch this stitch out, what will happen if I slow redraw it here is it's going to stitch the first tack down or placement line here, then it's going to stitch it again in a different color, which is our tack down, and then it's going to stitch our chenille lines across. And you can see how it jumped over to the side there, but that's okay for this. All right, so that's how we would do this block. All we need to do now is save it and stitch it out. So if it bothers you, just a side note, if it bothers you that this is no longer aligned to the rulers, well, that's an easy fix. Just select it all, come up here to our alignment, click it. There's a center to rulers. So if I click that, it's going to recenter that design on the rulers. But you know, it's just a visual reference for us. It really wouldn't matter a whit to how this stitched out on your machine. So last thing I want to talk about is what if we want to do a chenille on something other than a square block? Well, that's certainly possible. Let's grab a new piece of paper, a new design window by clicking our new design icon right here. And we could do a shape. So for example, I can go to my custom shapes here, and I could click any shape I want to do a chenille with. Like if I wanted to do a chenille on this butterfly, I could do that. I probably want to make this much bigger, so let's take a look at our size here. So we're at 3.42 inches wide. Let me turn on maintain aspect ratio, so I just have to change one. Probably want to make this about a 5-inch butterfly. So let's click apply, and that's pretty big. I'm going to go back to my artwork, turn off the fill, so we can just see the butterfly outline. And then same thing applies. If I wanted to go straight across with my chenille stitches, I could just do the chenille stitches now, but I can also rotate this butterfly to any degree I want. So let's say if I wanted to do a 60 degree, I click apply, and then I can see that my lines are going across, and I would just draw in those lines. And I can see my grid. It looks pretty darn good for the edges here just by happenstance. So I would draw all these lines in. One thing is that since this shape is not continuous, you would want to draw this line and then skip down here and draw this line. Okay, that's I think the only place you need to do that. But just be aware of you don't want to make the line go through empty space out here. All right, and then for this, definitely you would want to trim your fabric to the shape of the butterfly once you were done with the tack down line before you stitch the cross lines. So that wraps up the software portion of our video. So just a few final thoughts. There are some helpful tools you might want to get that are going to help you in the construction of this block. First of all, there's some special purpose chenille slicing tools like you can see in the picture here on the left. And there's several different brands out there. This is one of them. You can also use the Floriani Trim Safe angle scissors. So those are nice scissors that have a little bump and a non-sharp edge on one side, and they're at a nice angle. So those would be really great for getting in between the stitches and trimming down the center line of those strips. And you're also going to need a brush to rough up the edges. Now they make special chenille brushes, but you can use a stiff toothbrush or any brush really. And then the fabric that you use for the chenille fabric, a loose weave fabric works better than a tight weave fabric. So this is a good place to use your not so great quilt fabric or other not so great fabric. Flannel also gives a good effect. And you'll want to lay the fabric, especially if it's a normal weave fabric, on the bias to get maximum fluff. And you also want to make sure that your fabric color is good or printed through on both sides, because you're actually going to see both sides of the fabric when you fluff it up. So a lot of fabric these days is just printed on one side. You want to make sure that you don't get fabric like that for the chenille fabric. So I want to thank you for watching. I invite you to come back next month for Total Quilter Monthly.